Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Professor Sandeep, for that introduction. My name is James. I'm one of the undergraduate fellows here at the Cogut Institute, and I study comparative literature and anthropology. And what I will be introducing today is sort of a peek at what will eventually materialize into a senior thesis in comparative literature. So as a student, I'm most broadly interested in the various theoretical, philosophical, and literary movements that sprout out of the end of the 19th century into the beginning and the middle of the 20th century. So more specifically, that means modernist and avant-garde literatures, post-colonial studies, and the sort of like melting pot of philosophies and theories that we come to call critical theory. In my comparative literature studies, I work mostly between French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And these three languages sort of violently, but also very beautifully clash and converge in a geographical space that we refer to as Latin America and the Caribbean. So as you can imagine, as a Cogut Fellow, I'll be researching and comparing avant-garde texts produced in French, Spanish, and Portuguese in Latin America and the Caribbean. The title of my project is Rereading Modernity, Specters of Cannibalism in the Caribbean Avant-Garde. And I know cannibalism can be a provocative idea. It initially fills us with sort of discomfort, if not disgust. But in the Latin American context, I argue, cannibalism has an incredibly rich history of being used as a metaphor. The act of cannibalism, this idea of biting into and consuming another, pushes us to reconsider how we consume and digest texts within greater paradigms of cultural exchange across languages and borders. This is perhaps most famously the case in Brazil, where in 1928, a poet by the name of Oswald de Andrade publishes the Manifesto Antropófago, the Cannibalist Manifesto. It's a short essay that calls for Brazilians to devour their European predecessors and to produce a distinctly Latin American literary tradition. There's one iconic line from the manifesto I want to underline very quickly, which is "Tupi or not Tupi?" That's the question. It's from this epithet that a good chunk of my interest has blossomed, because Andrade is taking a line from Hamlet, to be or not to be, and he's replacing to be with Tupi, T-U-P-I, which was an indigenous group that inhabited Brazil before colonial contact and that was known to practice cannibalistic rituals. So here, Andrade is eating Shakespeare. He's sort of biting and swallowing Hamlet, and he shamelessly regurgitates him into the figure of the Tupi cannibal. What interests me here is the temporal nature of this consumption, because these scraps of European, African, and indigenous presence that we understand to exist across Latin American history are the remnants of a colonial past that persists in the present and the future. So these are specters. They're ghostly, they haunt, and they elude conventional means of articulating existence and presence. The history of colonialism has a very material, like very easily identifiable material legacy, but it's actually this non-present present that haunts avant-garde movements I'm seeing. And it sort of tracks these writers that are hoping to produce literature that critiques their society and that sort of explains the ills that we face as we modernize. We see a similar tension in parts of the Caribbean, so in Cuba and also on the island of Martinique, where the writer Suzanne Césaire, for example, is declaring that modern Martinican literature must be cannibalistic, actually, if it is to exist at all. So she draws from contemporary currents of French surrealism and this complex dynamic history of African traditions and produces a literature that suspends her subjects, to borrow from Fanon, another Martinican thinker, in a zone of non-being. That's to say that to cannibalize is not only to confuse being, but also time. We devour the past, we digest it in the present, and we regurgitate it into the future. We throw into flight all preconceived notions of time, being, and ultimately origin. So my big question here is, how does the Caribbean eat with ghosts? By that I mean, how does the act of cannibalism unsettle, but also deepen our understanding of how the specters of the past influence how texts are produced, consumed, and circulated through a modernizing economy? I'm thankful to the Cogut for giving me a chance to speak today and give you all a taste of what's to come, so to speak. And I'm thrilled at what lies ahead this year as a Cogut Fellow. Thank you so much.